Elena Brooks pushed open the door to Lion's Rest, just as the sharp crash of shattering glass split the thick, heavy air. Every head in the bar snapped toward the woman in the white tank top, her stride so calm it felt unreal. No one in that dim, smoky room knew that the worst mistake of their lives had just begun the moment she stepped inside. Flickering neon lights washed across Elena's cold, carved features, the face of a 38-year-old woman who had spent far too many years in shadows the people of Riverside could not begin to imagine. The smell of cigarette smoke, stale beer, and tired, rotting wood merged into something dense and uneasy, much like the prying stairs sliding across her face. They saw a woman walking alone. They saw powerful shoulders beneath a thin shirt. They thought she was out of place or worse, an easy target. And they were wrong about everything. Elena chose the last seat at the bar, gave the bartender a brief gesture, and set a bill on the scratched wooden surface. She did not speak. She didn't need to. This town knew when to shout and when to stay silent, and Lion's Rest was the place where people kept quiet just to hear where trouble would spark from next. Her gaze skimmed the mirror behind the bar, reflecting every shape in the room. 3 men at the pool table, an elderly couple along the wall, a drunk slumped over his drink. Everything familiar, predictable. Except for what was about to happen. The roar of a motorcycle engine rolled in from outside, followed by the heavy footfalls of 5 men pushing through the door. Elena didn't need to turn around to know who they were. The shift in the air told her everything. Conversations died instantly. A pool cue froze mid-stroke. The bartender dropped his gaze out of pure survival instinct. The Iron Wolves biker gang had arrived, led by Travis Bear Maddox, the man who believed he ruled Riverside with fists instead of law. Bear filled the doorway, his frame so large it blocked the remaining light. At 42 years old, he moved like a predator used to hunting, wearing a smile that never reached his eyes. His gaze swept the bar, then locked onto Elena, lighting with the satisfaction of a man spotting prey alone in an open field. He had no idea who he was looking at. No idea that the woman quietly sipping whiskey had served in units so secret even their reports had been erased. But he didn't need the truth to walk straight into his own grave. Bear's lips curled as he ordered drinks for his men, then began to approach Elena, each step heavy like a warning. Others in the bar stared down into their glasses, avoiding his eyes as if avoiding a blade about to drop. Elena watched everything through the mirror, every shift, every uneasy breath, every flicker of worry. She knew men like him. She had met them in the deserts of the Middle East, in covert operations across Eastern Europe, in slums where power was purchased with blood. Everywhere the same pattern repeated. Men believed they were strong because they were big. They never realized where real strength lived. Bear stopped behind her, radiating the sour smell of cheap beer and old cigarettes, the same stench she had encountered in too many Target safe houses. She didn't turn, didn't react. She simply lifted her glass and let the warm whiskey slide down her throat. Her calmness irritated him. He wanted bowed heads, trembling, fear the thrill of dominance. Elena offered him none of that, and that was when his game began to crack. Inside, Elena was only silence. Not fear, not worry, just that familiar stillness before a storm breaks. She hadn't come looking for trouble. Trouble had come looking for her. And tonight's trouble, even if it made the entire bar hold its breath, had no idea how close it was walking to a cliff it would be the first to fall from. Elena set her glass down and brushed her fingertips across the old wooden bar. Outside, night winds rattled the flickering streetlights. Inside the room waited in absolute stillness, and with just one word, one movement, one wrong decision from the man standing inches behind her, his entire life would change in ways he could never imagine. Elena knew it. The bar knew it. Only Bear didn't. And that was where everything began. Elena hadn't even lifted her glass a second time when the scrape of a chair behind her signaled exactly what the entire bar had been bracing for. Travis Bear. Maddox stepped in close enough that his hot alcohol-soaked breath brushed the back of her neck. His hands planted on the bar, blocking her exit and claiming her space as if the whole room belonged to him. His men spread out in a loose arc, their eyes gleaming with a mix of anticipation and cruelty, like hyenas catching the scent of meat. They thought they were about to witness cheap entertainment. Not one of them understood they were standing on the edge of a mistake. Elena still didn't turn. That wounded Bear's pride. In his mind, a mid-30s white woman sitting alone in a bar should have flinched or stepped back the moment he approached. But Elena did none of that. Her stillness made something ugly churn inside him. He was big, broad muscles swelling beneath his leather jacket, but to Elena he was nothing more than another version of the men she had neutralized on battlefields, oversized bodies that meant nothing once truth arrived. He stepped closer again, a low growl rising from his throat and making a few patrons jump. The bartender, far too familiar with Iron Wolf's power plays, kept his head down, hands trembling slightly as he wiped a perfectly clean glass. He knew Elena wasn't like the women who usually drifted into this place, but he didn't know who she was. How many rooms drenched in violence she had walked into before this one, and he certainly didn't know that even a soft sigh from her could be the signal for a storm. Elena tilted her gaze toward the mirror. Bear's reflection sharpened behind her, his face-twisted eyes burning with the crude dominance he wore like a second skin. He lifted his hand, a small movement, a cheap power gesture he had repeated hundreds of times. And that moment alone made several heartbeats in the bar stutter. Not because they cared for her, but because everyone knew Bear only ever made things worse. His hand came down. But instead of blocking or dodging, Elena remained perfectly still. The quiet stretched for 2 tense breaths, then the slap landed sharp and crude. His palm struck her with the entitled force of a man convinced he had the right. Laughter erupted from his men, loud and metallic, turning the room darker. Hector the biker, with a long scar across his neck, slammed his hand on the table, howling with delight. Another whistled mockingly. Elena did not move. Not a flinch, not a startled breath, not even the smallest sign of the fear Bear was waiting for. And that was when the laughter thinned. A few men hesitated, sensing without understanding why that something was wrong. The bar tightened silence, returning heavier than the rumble of motorcycles outside. Elena set her whiskey down her fingertip, brushing the cool rim of the glass. She exhaled slowly, so softly it was barely perceptible. But in that breath lived something these men would never understand: restraint. She had been taught that a professional soldier never used force before it was necessary, never acted before the equation was complete. And now every sense in her body stretched outward, reading the room the way a musician reads a familiar song. Bear leaned in, about to whisper something filthy in her ear, but Elena had already turned her head. Her eyes, calm to the point of coldness, met his. In the instant, her gaze locked onto him. The bar seemed to collapse into a single point. And Bear, a man who had spent his entire life using fists to force others down, froze for a brief betraying heartbeat. He didn't know why his pulse skipped, didn't understand the unmistakable warning buried in her eyes. But he dismissed it. He always dismissed it. Elena rose, her movement light as breath, yet enough to make several men instinctively step back. She turned fully to face him, and in that moment the entire room understood something Bear did not. He was not the hunter here. He was the one stepping straight into the tiger's jaws, and the storm he had carelessly awakened was about to break without a single warning. The air inside Lion's Rest seemed to solidify the moment Elena rose to her full height. The men crowding around the pool table fell silent, the cue stick freezing mid-air. The bartender instinctively stepped back, as if sensing something had just slipped outside the normal orbit of trouble. And Bear, who until now believed he held every advantage, took another step straight into the invisible trap he had built for himself. Elena didn't speak, but her silence carried more weight than any threat could. She stared directly at Bear, her eyes cold as the steel of the sniper rifle that had once traveled with her through long nights on the outskirts of Kandahar. Bear didn't know that. All he saw was a woman who wasn't afraid of him, and he hated that more than anything. His oversized ego surged, pushing him closer, his chest rising and falling as if a single word would be enough to make him explode. But Elena stayed utterly still. She let her patience grind against his aggression inch by inch, as though she were waiting for the exact moment to strike. In Bear's mind, her silence was the greatest provocation. A low hey drifted from the back table. The old drunk, who had been slumped over all evening, lifted his head, his bloodshot eyes fixed on the tension drawn tight across the room. He shook his head and muttered something like a warning, though no one bothered to listen. They were far too used to Bear intimidating weaker people, but tonight they were watching something far more dangerous, a bully standing in front of a lion that only looked like it was sleeping. Bear straightened, wearing a mocking grin, then jabbed his silver-ringed finger into Elena's whiskey glass, flicking droplets onto the floor. The gesture was small but dripping with domination. He wanted to shatter her calm. He wanted fear, or at the very least a crude reaction. But Elena only looked at the spilled whiskey, then lifted her gaze back to him. That look alone made a few bikers behind him step back without realizing it. What flickered through their eyes wasn't fear, but the sudden awareness that they were standing too close to a fault line. Travis laughed louder, trying to drown the unease beginning to spark in his chest. He was used to ruling this room, to seeing others tremble. But Elena's composure felt like a crack crawling along his confidence. He lifted his hand, intending to grab her shoulder with his usual roughness. In that instant, several bikers held their breath. They didn't know why. They only sensed that something was about to spin loose from control. His hand never reached her. Elena's movement sliced through the silence like a blade through fog. A slight shift of her body, a nearly invisible turn of her wrist. It was over before anyone could see the pieces. The bartender only caught a flash of white fabric before Bear let out a choked groan. Elena had caught his wrist in midair. No shout, no warning. Just one precise motion delivered with surgical cruelty. She tightened her grip not with brute force, but with exact pressure. A single strike at the tendon collapsed Bear as if someone had shoved him from behind. His men lurched forward, chairs screeching, but none dared take a step closer. Not because Bear was kneeling at Elena's feet, but because the speed she displayed did not belong to any ordinary woman. Bear's groan trembled through the dead silence. He tried to stand, but every time he moved, Elena adjusted her angle, and his body dropped harder. The man who had terrorized Riverside for years now knelt in the center of the bar, completely helpless, his eyes wide, less from pain than from disbelief. In his mind, a single question finally broke through, one he had never imagined asking: "Who is she?" Behind him, a few bikers retreated another step, survival instincts forcing them back from whatever was unfolding in front of them. A bitter truth was clawing its way into their heads. Not Bear, not the gang, but Elena was the one controlling the room tonight. Elena leaned down just enough for her breath to brush Bear's ear. Her voice was low, steady, cold, as steel dipped in ice water. No threat. No anger, just the truth sharp enough to make every witness shiver. Bear heard every word, and for the first time in many years he understood what it meant to stand before someone he should never have touched. Elena released him, and Bear collapsed onto the floor, gasping as though the strength had been drained from his entire body. She didn't look at him again. She didn't need to. The whole bar had already understood everything. And the first plot twist of the night revealed itself. The woman they thought was an easy target was the most dangerous person in the room. Elena rose to her full height, smoothing the hem of her shirt as if she had merely adjusted a misplaced glass, rather than dropping the leader of the Iron Wolves to his knees in the middle of the bar. That calm, almost casual gesture sent a ripple through the room, something wordless and unsettling. Bear was still kneeling on the floor, his trembling hand clutching his throbbing wrist, his expression shifting from anger to confusion, then finally to fear, a feeling he neither recognized nor accepted. His men closed in behind him, but none dared step forward. Each of them glanced at the others in silent panic, as if unsure whether they should attack or run. Elena caught sight of them in the bar mirror. 4 bikers, creeping carefully, slowly, with the exact tension she had once seen in men picking their way through crumbling houses on the outskirts of Jalalabad, where every footstep might trigger something lethal. She recognized their fear long before they recognized it themselves. And that fear was not because Bear had been taken down. It was because they had no idea what kind of person she was. Bear hissed through ragged breaths, desperate to claw back some scrap of authority. You think you are something." His voice cracked like rotten floorboards, underweight collapsing beneath a humiliation he had never tasted. Elena did not answer right away. She bent to retrieve her whiskey, took a small sip, letting the warm burn drift down her throat. Only then did she turn her gaze to Bear, a look cold enough to make him flinch as if doused in ice water. "Who I am matters less than the mistake you just made." The simple sentence stretched the silence in the room even tighter. A biker behind Bear stepped back, bumping into a table and knocking over a beer, but none of them turned to look. Every eye stayed fixed on Elena and Bear, as though afraid that blinking would turn the moment into something far worse. Bear tried to stand, but the stabbing pain in his wrist sent him stumbling forward. Shame hit him harder than the injury. All his life he had controlled the town with fists, roaring engines, and deadly stares. He was used to submission, fear, the quick retreat of anyone who crossed his path. But tonight, he was on his knees in front of a woman he had dismissed as entertainment. 2 seconds later, Bear's eyes drifted away from her. He scanned the room as if hunting for someone to rescue him from the humiliation crushing him. No one moved. The entire bar had gone stiff as stone, and that sudden loneliness right there in a crowded room made him understand something: his power no longer worked. Elena swirled the whiskey in her glass, the pale gold reflection dancing in her steady eyes, creating something soft yet unmistakably dangerous. She stepped closer to Bear. Just one step yet enough to make his men tighten their fists in reflex. Not to attack, but to reassure themselves they still had something solid to hold on to. She leaned down, her voice low, sharp, slicing through the air. "You just hit the worst possible person in this room." Bear opened his mouth, ready to roar back, but his throat locked. He tried to rebuild his usual mask of intimidation, but for the first time in his life, that mask bent under the weight of a single look. Behind them, the bartender clenched his jaw and pretended to stay busy, though his eyes kept flicking toward Elena in disbelief. He had lived more than 30 years in Riverside, had seen strong men, reckless men, insane men, but he had never watched anyone make the iron wolves freeze solid with nothing but a few quiet words. Elena set her glass on the bar, the sound crisp and final against the wood. She straightened and turned her back on Bear, treating him as if he no longer held enough value to acknowledge. That indifference struck deeper than any blow. A few bikers whispered under their breath. One froze when he caught her eyes in the mirror. Another stared at Bear's limp wrist, as if trying to figure out what exactly she had broken with a single twist of her hand. None of them knew that Elena had calculated every detail of the room, the width of the walkway, the exact placement of every person, the drunk's level of intoxication. The curve of the bar countered the distance between her and the exit. She had processed it all within seconds. It wasn't instinct. It was training. It was a past she had buried for 2 years since leaving the military. A past men like Bear could never see coming. When Elena stepped once to the left, then another step toward the door, the entire bar understood that they had just witnessed a complete shift in power. Bear was no longer the predator. He was nothing but a warped shadow of himself kneeling on the cold wooden floor, while the woman he dared to touch walked away as lightly as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. Something the whole of Riverside would soon be forced to confront. Bear had crossed the wrong person, and tonight was only the beginning of the price he would pay. Elena left the bar with a composure so effortless that everyone inside Lion's Rest felt a chill run down their spine. She walked past the bikers as if they were nothing more than scattered shadows on the floor, not the men who had terrorized Riverside for years. Each step she took was steady and deliberate, as if her mind had switched into tactical mode the moment Bear laid a hand on her. No one knew what calculations were running through her head, but everyone understood one truth. The storm was not over. It was only beginning. When she pushed the door open and stepped into the night, the cool Montana air filled her lungs, carrying the scents of dusty roads, pine resin, and the faint breath of the nearby lake. The soft yellow glow of the street lights seeped into the thin mist, making the empty road look like a scene from a distant film. Elena stood still for a few seconds, letting her eyes adjust, though in reality, she was listening. Not for footsteps, not for the wind, but for the strange silence behind her. The silence of men who had just been unmasked on their own territory. Then the familiar growl of an engine echoed from behind. The door slammed open and Bear burst outside like an animal that had been provoked too far. His face was flushed with pain and humiliation. He wanted to roar, to reclaim his pride, to drag Elena back inside and force her to kneel before him. But the moment he stepped onto the porch, he froze. Elena had not even turned around. She only shifted slightly, her cold gaze sliding over her shoulder as if she were assessing a minor threat approaching from a distance. The way she looked at him made his throat tighten. It was not the gaze of a victim, not the gaze of someone powerless. It was the look of someone who had put far more dangerous men on the ground with nothing but her bare hands. Bear had no idea what her past held, but something ancient and primal in him warned that taking one more step would cost him more than his pride. But Bear had never learned how to back down. His 42 years of living through fists and violence had left him incapable of understanding that silence could be a warning. The only thing he heard was the furious howl inside his own chest, demanding he prove the savagery that had kept him feared for so long. Elena turned to face him, not fast, not slow, but with undeniable authority. Her hands hung loosely at her sides, but her entire body carried a sharp, poised energy, calm, yet edged like a blade, soft, yet ready to erupt. There was no anger on her face, no hatred, only a quiet certainty, the kind found in the eyes of people who had lived too long on the line between life and death. Bear stared at her, and for the first time he saw himself reflected in someone else's eyes, a brute, a fool, a bully, whose strength only existed when his opponent was weaker. His fists clenched, the knuckles turning white. One of his bikers hurried after him, trying to hold him back, but Bear barked a curse and shoved the arm away. Elena exhaled softly, one short breath almost regretful. In that moment, she didn't look at Bear as an enemy. She looked at him like someone who could have chosen a different path, but instead ran straight toward the edge. She spoke, her voice low, soft, yet ringing clear like metal striking metal. "This is not the fight you want to pick." Bear let out a harsh, broken laugh, twisting with bitterness. "You think you're better than me? You're just a womb." The sentence died in his throat, not because he was afraid, but because of what he saw behind him. The door to the bar had not fully closed, and through its narrow opening, Bear glimpsed his own men inside. But none were laughing, none were yelling, none were cheering. They stood silent, staring at Elena, their eyes stripped of mockery. What replaced it was something Bear had never seen in them before: caution. In a fleeting instant, Bear understood something that drained the heat from his bloodstream. Tonight, he did not control that room. He did not control his men. He did not control Elena. And maybe he had never truly controlled anything at all. Elena gave him one final look, calm as still water before a storm. Then she turned away and walked toward her vehicle. Each step she took hammered another nail into the coffin of the reputation Bear had built over the years. He shouted after her empty threats thrown into the night, angry and desperate. But the wind swallowed them whole, leaving him small and alone in the darkness. And in that moment, Elena knew with absolute clarity Bear would not accept this humiliation. He would come back. And next time, he would not come alone. But Elena also knew something far more important, something Bear could never imagine. She had spent years preparing for battles much worse than anything he was capable of bringing. Elena drove away from Lion's Rest, leaving behind the fading rumble of motorcycle engines. The Montana night stretched out before her, lit only by scattered street lights and a thin veil of mist settling over the silent rows of pine trees on each side of the road. Her hand remained steady on the wheel, but deep in her mind, an old switch had flipped the quiet alertness she had carried since her years on the battlefield. She knew Bear would lose control. Men like him, when humiliated in front of their crew, always reacted in one of two ways. They charged straight toward retaliation, or they withdrew to plan a cheap ambush. And Elena knew with absolute certainty that Bear Maddox was not the type with enough intelligence to choose the second option. Her car glided through the empty neighborhood where small houses rested under the dim glow of porch lights. But as she approached her home, something felt wrong. Not a sound, not a flicker of movement. It was the air itself, that unmistakable tension only people who had survived war zones could sense from a distance. She turned off the engine and sat still. Her eyelids lowered, her breathing slowed her entire body, easing into a state of total observation. She opened the door. A chemical smell and sharp scent of fresh paint hit her instantly. The garage light cast a faint glow across the surface of the door, revealing a smear of dark red. Elena stepped closer, each movement measured, neither rushed nor hesitant. When the light finally illuminated the surface fully, she saw the words sprayed in jagged, trembling strokes. "You're dead." The paint dripped in long streaks that resembled blood. Elena didn't freeze for more than a heartbeat. Her chest didn't rise. Her pulse didn't spike. Years of special operations had taught her to respond differently. Observe first. Assess. Second act last. She scanned the yard. No clear footprints on the dry ground. No fading engine noise. But the paint was still too fresh, meaning whoever had done this was gone no more than 10 minutes. A shaky voice floated from the neighboring porch. "Elena. Dear, what's going on over there?" Mrs. Janet Miller, her silver hair draped over her shoulders, clutched a thin shawl as she peered anxiously over the fence. Elena instantly smoothed the cold hardness from her eyes. She turned, offering a small, gentle smile, meant to comfort. "It's nothing, Mrs. Janet. Probably some kids messing around." Her tone was soft, steady, flawlessly reassuring, revealing none of the storm tightening behind her ribs. Mrs. Janet frowned. "Kids don't spray something like that. Do you want me to call the police?" Elena shook her head. "No need, ma'am. I can handle it." Her calmness eased the older woman's nerves, but Elena understood what that refusal meant. She was protecting those around her. If the police got involved, Sheriff Wilkins would hear about it. And Wilkins was the sheriff Bear used to bury every dirty trick. Elena refused to drag anyone else into this, especially someone as fragile as Mrs. Janet, someone who had no idea what the iron wolves were truly capable of. Once the older woman went back inside, Elena turned to the garage again. She touched the red paint lightly. Cold. Wet. Still tacky. That meant the culprit had left minutes ago. Maybe one of Bear's men. Maybe Bear himself. But the sloppiness of the letters told her something more important. They were scared. Scared enough that they hadn't stood close, scared enough their hands shook as they sprayed. Scared of what? Not the law. Not the town. They were scared of her. Elena walked toward her front door. Her eyes flicked over every detail. The doormat slightly shifted to the right, as she always left it. In the morning, the front door untouched with no pry marks, no drag lines from gloves. Everything looked exactly the same. But the unease clung to her. She unlocked the door and stood at the threshold, listening. The house was silent enough that she could hear the heater running in its steady rhythm. No movement, no footsteps, no sign of intrusion. She locked the door behind her and stepped into the living room without turning on the lights. Her eyes adjusted to the dimness, and she let the darkness settle around her like an old companion. In that quiet, she replayed every moment since leaving Lion's Rest Bear's furious stare, the way his men stepped back, the engines revving behind her. Bear would seek revenge. He would return. But what made Elena frown was not the thought of him coming after her. It was the question, where would he strike first? Her home. Or worse, the place she had spent the last 2 years rebuilding her life, the Veterans Center. The thought shifted her breath only slightly, but enough to confirm what her instincts had already warned her. This was no longer a personal conflict. And if Bear intended to threaten what she protected, then he had made a mistake far greater than the stupid slap he threw inside the bar tonight. Elena stood in the dark living room, not turning on the lights, letting the night wrap around her like an old, familiar coat. It wasn't because she feared being seen. It was because, in darkness, her memory and instincts sharpened, tightening into the precision honed through years on the battlefield. War had taught her that darkness didn't hide danger. It revealed it to those who knew how to look. She walked into the kitchen, filled a glass of water, and listened to the faint metallic drip of the faucet, a distant echo of warning. The only light came from the wall clock, glowing a dim bluish green. As the second hand completed its slow circle, Elena saw again the full image of Bear's face under the bar lights, the rage, the humiliation, the fear he tried but failed to hide. She remembered his eyes as he knelt on the cold wooden floor. They were not the eyes of a man about to explode. They were the eyes of a man who would seek revenge by any means necessary. Her phone buzzed lightly on the counter. A message. Not family. Not a friend. Elena unlocked the screen. A short text from Marcus, "You okay, heard Bear," rolled into the bar with his whole crew. Elena stared at the words in the dark. Marcus was always perceptive, always hearing things before anyone else. Without asking, he already sensed something was wrong. She typed back, "I'm fine. Don't worry." But as soon as she hit send, her eyes closed briefly. She didn't want Marcus to know what she had found on her garage door. Not because she didn't trust him, but because she knew exactly that Bear would not stop at spray paint. When a man like him gets humiliated, he strikes where it hurts most. And for Elena, that place was the Veterans Center. She set the glass down on the counter, the sound soft but deliberate, like loading a magazine into a rifle. The darkness in the living room no longer felt silent. It felt alive, breathing, waiting, warning. Elena went to her bedroom and opened the drawer beside the bed. Not for a gun, she had left that part of her life behind when she left the military. Instead, she pulled out a small walnut box, something she suddenly felt the need to see tonight. The lid lifted open to reveal Patch's silver medals, service ribbons, a faded unit card, and a triangular piece of cloth once part of the folded flag from a farewell ceremony years ago. Her fingers brushed over each item, old memories rising like cold wind from distant places. She remembered nights on base when the air was so cold, her breath turned white, the pounding rotors of helicopters tearing through the dark, the moments standing in ruined zones where everything could disappear in a single explosion, the names on the list of those who would never return. Elena closed her eyes for a second. There were battles she thought she had left behind, but Bear had dragged her back toward a ground she had once refused to look at again. A soft sound outside the window made Elena open her eyes immediately. One sound, tiny, but enough to ignite every combat nerve in her body. She did not turn on the light. The darkness was her ally. She moved silently to the window, stepping to the side to avoid a clean line of fire, then pulled the curtain just wide enough to see through. Only a branch brushing the roof. But Elena did not let her breath slip out. Her instincts never allowed comfort. She moved away from the window, grabbed her phone, and dialed a number. Not the police, not the Veterans Center, but the one person who understood exactly what she was capable of when pushed into a corner. A man's voice answered deep and alert with a note of surprise at such a late call. "Elena, what's going on?" She looked back at the box, at the symbols and medals, and fractured past inside it. Then her gaze shifted to the garage outside, where the red threat still glistened under the cold night. She spoke slowly, each word compressed like forged steel. "I need you to check something for me. Bear Maddox. Iron Wolves. They've started coming to my house." The line was silent for several seconds. Then the man's tone dropped heavy and serious. "Elena, are you pulling me into this?" Her fingers tightened around the phone, her eyes shining in the darkness. "I don't need anyone involved. I just need to know what I'm about to fight." The silence stretched, long, and waited. "Then I understand. I'll look into it." Elena hung up. She looked around her small home, the place she once hoped would be the beginning of a peaceful life. But peace did not come to people like her. Not ever. And tonight she finally understood the most important part. Bear wasn't just a brute losing control. He was pulling her toward a real war. Yet that realization didn't frighten Elena. It steadied her. Because the moment Bear sprayed that red message across her garage door, he unknowingly awakened the woman she had spent years trying to suppress. The woman Bear should never have wanted to face. Dawn hadn't fully risen, but the pale blue light of early morning slipped through the gap in the curtains and stretched across the wooden floor of the living room. Elena had barely slept, not out of fear, but because her mind had shifted into calculation, analysis, and preparation for what she knew with absolute certainty was coming. Bear never stopped after a threat. Men like him always came back, and when they did, they went after the people who couldn't defend themselves. Her phone buzzed on the table. Another message from Marcus. "You coming in this morning? Got a few new vets stopping by for help." I opened early. Elena read the words, and for a moment her chest softened. Marcus had no idea the fight had already reached her front door. No idea that in a single night, the entire Veterans Center could have been thrown into danger. She typed, "I'm on my way." And this time, she wasn't lying. When Elena stepped into the Riverside Veterans Outreach Center, the gentle morning light streamed across the large windows, reflecting onto the worn wooden tables where veterans often spent their mornings talking. The warm smell of fresh coffee drifted from the small kitchen where Marcus was wrestling with the old machine he treated like an adopted child. He looked up the moment Elena walked in, his eyes tightening as if he could immediately sense something was wrong. She hadn't said a word, but one look at her face told him everything. "You all right?" he asked immediately. "You look tense." Elena didn't want to lie to Marcus, but she didn't want to drop fear onto his shoulders either. Years on the battlefield had taught her that hiding the truth often caused more damage than speaking it. After a few seconds of hesitation, she nodded. Something happened. Bear and the Iron Wolves. "They came by my house last night." Marcus slammed the cup onto the counter, the sharp sound startling two old veterans nearby. He stepped closer to her, his voice low but tight as wire. "What did they do?" Elena exhaled slowly. Just spray paint. A death threat. But it was fresh. Very fresh. Meaning they left not long before I got home. Marcus frowned. They targeting you or the center? The question struck straight into the fear she'd been carrying. Elena looked around the room, familiar faces marked by exhaustion, but lit with the quiet hope of rebuilding men and women carrying wounds. No one could see people stitching their lives back together, piece by fragile piece. They were vulnerable in ways most people never understood. One attack could shatter all of them. She spoke softly, her voice thick as morning fog. I think they're targeting anyone connected to me, which means this place is a target. Marcus clenched his hands, the knuckles turning white beneath his skin. No way in hell I'm letting them touch this place. No way. What surprised Elena wasn't the words. It was the real burning anger in his voice. Marcus was not the hot-headed type. He was kind, patient, almost out of place in a world that moved too fast. But today, that gentleness was replaced by the fierce instinct to protect the same instinct Elena had once seen in some of the best soldiers she'd served with. Other veterans began to notice the tension. Among them was Sarah Chen, a former Army nurse, who stepped closer with a sharp, probing look. "What's going on?" she asked. Elena glanced at the faces turning toward her. She knew telling them would spark fear. But she also knew the truth. Bear Maddox was no longer her problem alone. He had become everyone's threat. She told them everything, leaving out nothing. When she reached the part about the message on her garage door, Sarah pressed a hand to her mouth, and Tom Wheeler, the Vietnam veteran, tightened his grip on his cane so hard his fingers trembled. In the bright morning light, something heavy filled the room. Not fear, fury. The kind carried by people who had suffered enough, been ignored enough, but who refused to let darkness into the one place they finally felt safe. Tom Wheeler spoke first, his voice rough, but fierce. "We're not letting that animal tear this place apart. Not again." His words struck like a spark against a waiting flame. Marcus nodded, his eyes flashing with a focus Elena rarely saw. Sarah straightened her posture, more soldier than support worker now. Elena looked at each of them, feeling the energy building in the room. She had led teams into danger before. She knew the look in people's eyes when they were preparing themselves for a fight. And the eyes staring back at her now carried that same resolve, that same discipline, that same transformation of fear into strength. Something shifted inside Elena. She had never wanted to drag them into her personal war. But it was clear this wasn't personal anymore. Elena drew a breath and spoke clearly. "If they come for this center, they'll have to go through all of us." The room went silent for a single heartbeat. Then Sarah stepped forward, her voice firm as steel. "Then teach us. Teach us how to protect it." Elena looked at them, at Marcus, at Sarah, at Tom, at Jenny, at the veterans who carried lifelong wounds, but still stood tall. They weren't elite soldiers. They weren't young. They weren't fast. They weren't strong the way they once were. But they had something the Iron Wolves would never possess, a fighting spirit that could not be bought threatened or crushed. Elena nodded. And in that moment, the Riverside Veterans Outreach Center was no longer just a support facility. It became the first base camp of the counterattack. The afternoon drifted by in an eerie quiet, as if the entire town of Riverside was holding its breath, waiting for the storm to break. Elena stood in the backyard of the Veterans Center, where old tables and broken chairs had been pushed aside to clear an open training space. Above her, the Montana sky spread into a thick gray blue, the kind that warned a shift in weather was coming. But the storm Elena waited for wasn't brewing in the clouds. It was coming from the road out front, the road the iron wolves always thundered down like a pack of wild animals. Marcus approached with a stack of water bottles and training towels in his hands. He glanced over the cleared yard with a mix of worry and determination. "Everyone's ready," he said quietly, though his voice was drawn tight like a bowstring pulled to its final notch. Elena nodded. She stepped forward, looking at the dozen faces gathered and waiting for her. Some were young, some older. Some had once worn the rank of sergeant with pride. Some had served in supply lines instead of front lines. But in their eyes, Elena saw something she recognized from the finest elite teams she had ever commanded: the will. The will to do what was right. The will to protect one another. She spoke, her voice even and clear, not loud, but strong enough to reach every person. "Tonight we don't train because we're afraid. We train because we want to live right. Because we want to protect the place that helped us stand up again." No one moved. No one interrupted. It felt as if each person was storing her words somewhere deep inside. She continued, "Men like Bear Maddox are only strong when the other side is weak. He relies on fists, on shouting, but he doesn't know how to face people who know how to stand their ground." Several eyes sharpened with resolve. Sarah clenched her hands. Tom Wheeler drew a deep breath, his aging shoulders straightening the way they had long ago when he prepared to crawl under barbed wire. Elena stepped into the center of the yard. Her stance dropped low and steady, her feet planted like they were pinned into the earth. She raised a hand, signaling Marcus to step in as the attacker. He moved toward her, reaching out as if to grab her shoulder. In a single fluid motion, Elena pivoted, caught his wrist, shifted their combined weight, and redirected him with a controlled push. Marcus stumbled half a step back, not hurt, only shocked by the seamless precision of her control. That, Elena said, is what matters, not strength, but angle balance and calm. She called each person forward. Sarah stepped in first. Jenny followed. Tom Wheeler, hands trembling, still worked through every movement with grit and stubborn pride. Elena corrected their grips, adjusted their footing, fixed every habit they'd carried for years. Sometimes she spoke gently, sometimes her tone cut sharp, like an alarm, forcing them to unlearn what time had etched into their bodies. As the sun dipped behind the distant hills, each of them began executing movements they never thought their bodies could manage again. Marcus laughed out loud when Sarah twisted out of his grip with a perfect release. The entire group cheered when Tom successfully broke free of a wrist hold for the first time. Their laughter rang through the yard like a healing sound, but Elena knew it was also the sound of preparation for something dark drawing near. When the group finally paused to rest, Elena sat on the back step and watched them. They were tired, their shirts damp with sweat, but their eyes were bright alive. They had lit a fire Bear would never anticipate, the spirit of an army. Marcus sat beside her. "You really think they'll come?" he asked, his voice as low as the evening wind. Elena didn't answer right away. She looked toward the white wooden fence across the street where the streetlights were beginning to glow faintly. Riverside's residents had spent years living quietly, avoiding trouble, surviving under the shadow of Bear and his men. But Elena knew the truth of men like him. When shamed, they didn't retreat to reflect, they charged forward. They sought revenge, and tonight, even without seeing them, she could feel the violence shifting in the air. She spoke softly. "They'll come. If not tonight, then tomorrow. If not at the bar, then here." Marcus gritted his teeth. Let's see what they try when we're standing together like this. Elena looked at him. In his 33-year-old eyes, she saw the resolve of a soldier who had once lost a piece of himself to the war. Yet here, in this small backyard, among people rebuilding their lives one fragile step at a time, he had found himself again. Not through anger, but through responsibility. The darkness slowly swallowed half the sky. The wind grew stronger. The wrinkles at the corner of Tom's eyes deepened as he watched the dark road beyond the fence. Sarah stood near the door, hands on her hips, her gaze no longer soft like the nurse who arrived every morning. And Elena stood abruptly as if hearing a sound only she could detect. The wind carried the scent of motorcycle fuel, very faint, very distant, but real. Elena spoke quietly, her voice slicing through the rising night. "They're coming!" And as every head turned toward the thickening shadows at the end of the street, each person understood from this moment on, the fight was no longer theoretical. It had already begun. Night fell faster than usual, as if the sky itself sensed what was coming. The yellowed street lights cast a wary glow across the road. In the Veterans Center's backyard, Elena stood tall, her eyes locked on the dark end of the street where the scent of motorcycle fuel stretched through the air like a warning line. Every sound blended together, the wind cutting through the pine trees, the windows rattling softly, the rising heartbeat of the people standing around her. Then the sound grew clearer, the engines sharp and hungry, firing in rhythmic bursts that sliced through the air, like the roar of wild beasts freed from a cage. Marcus stepped up beside her, his shoulders tense. Sarah, Tom, Jenny, and the others drifted closer together, forming a natural line, their military instincts pulling them into formation without a word. The first beam of a headlight flickered at the corner. Then another. Then more. Bear hadn't come alone. He had brought the entire pack of iron wolves. Tires crunched over gravel headlights, sweeping wide arcs of pale light, creating a scene that would make any Riverside resident slam their doors shut in fear. But tonight, in this small backyard, no one stepped back. Elena didn't blink. She tracked every movement, calculated every distance, read every turn of their engines. The old tactical instincts surged through her as if they had never left. She stepped forward just enough to shield the group behind her. A small motion, but they understood Elena was the front line. The motorcycles came to a showy stop at the edge of the parking lot. Travis Bear. Maddox stepped off first, his boots striking the pavement like a declaration of war. Rage carved deep lines across his face, visible even from afar. He thought tonight he would bring fear. He didn't know he was the one carrying fear with him. The back gate creaked open. Elena stepped out before anyone else could move. The ground was cold beneath her feet, but her gaze burned. Bear saw her, and a cruel smile twisted across his lips. "So, you're really here?" He growled, his voice scraping like metal dragged over concrete. "I thought you'd be hiding behind these rotting walls." Elena didn't answer immediately. She met his stare without so much as a tremor. He searched for fear. He found only calm, a calm that infuriated him. "I'm not hiding," Elena said. "I'm standing exactly where I need to." Bear burst into laughter, the arrogant kind of a man convinced he held all the power. But the laugh barely lasted 3 beats before it died in his throat. Because he finally saw what he hadn't expected, the veterans behind Elena stepping out into the open. And they weren't bowing. They weren't backing away. They stood straight shoulder to shoulder like a combat unit. Marcus stood on Elena's right jaw set, Sarah angled just behind her left side eyes, sharp as steel. Tom Wheeler, the old soldier who still walked with a cane, planted it firmly into the ground like a weapon. Jenny, the former helicopter mechanic, positioned herself in support behind them. Bear scanned their faces, and for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his eyes. "You brought this group of cripples to stand against me," he roared, grasping for control. But no one laughed, no one flinched. They just stared back at him with the gaze of people who had survived real battlefields. Elena stepped forward, half a pace, her voice low and steady, but piercing the air. "This isn't a fight you can win with fists or shouting bear." The tension tightened like a drawn net. One younger biker behind Bear spat at the ground, trying to look tough. But Tom Wheeler leveled a calm, unblinking stare at him, the stare of a man who had seen death up close more than once. The biker froze, stepping back without meaning to. Bear spun toward him in disgust at the display of weakness. Elena saw it all, and in that instant, she understood something vital. For the first time, Bear wasn't fully in control of his own crew. She lowered her voice just enough for him alone to hear. "You're not here for payback. You're here to prove to your men that you're still the strongest. But you stopped being that last night." Bear clenched his jaw, rage pulsing through every vein. "I'll crush you, and this whole filthy place." Elena subtly shifted her stance, grounding her weight. Behind her, every veteran did the same, without needing instructions. They had no guns, no knives, only skill, experience, and the spirit of survivors who had endured far worse than a gang of bikers. And that was the part Bear did not understand. The wind picked up. A single leaf spiraled down between them, gently falling in a moment that contrasted sharply with the tension choking the air. Elena delivered her final warning, her voice striking like a hammer against steel. "Take one more step, Bear, and you'll learn for the first time in your life what it means to face people who aren't afraid of you." The world seemed to stop. Bear tightened his fists, ready to charge. But Elena wasn't watching him. She was watching what happened behind him. One of the bikers had spotted someone filming from a balcony across the street and immediately grabbed Bear's arm, whispering urgently. Bear whipped around, and there it was, the glow of a phone screen in the dark. A witness, a recording. The one thing he hated more than anything. His face drained of color. Elena saw it, and she knew the first battle was already won without throwing a single punch. She stepped back, half a pace, her eyes never leaving his. Leave. If you have a shred of sense left, walk away now. Bear seethed, furious and humiliated, but his crew had already wavered. He couldn't attack Elena while someone was filming. He couldn't strike the veteran's center in front of so many watching eyes. He let out a frustrated roar, slammed his boot into the ground, and leapt onto his bike. "Don't think this is over," he shouted over the roar of the engine. "I'll be back. And next time, you won't stand so tall." The motorcycles tore into the darkness, leaving behind only the stench of fuel and the grit of scattered gravel. Marcus exhaled, hard hands braced on his knees. Sarah stayed frozen, eyes locked on the street. Tom Wheeler lowered his cane, breathing uneven, but eyes glowing with fire. Elena watched the bikes vanish. No relief, no victory, only a cold certainty sliding along her spine. This was only the opening act, and the real war began now. From the perspective of a specialist in community conflict and post-trauma psychology, the story of Elena Brooks reveals a truth that never changes. Violence is confident only when it believes it will face no resistance. But real strength comes from people who once thought they had nothing left to give. It is the unity, discipline, and fighting spirit of the veterans that makes tyrants tremble. When a community's fear is replaced with courage, the power of the bully collapses instantly. If you believe that standing up for what is right can change an entire town, hit like and subscribe to help spread that message. And leave a short comment. Stand strong.